Imagine a secret police force so pervasive and absolute in its control that it can track your unique scent, destroy your mental health with subtle psychological torture, and even carefully examine the contents of every letter you send. This was the terrifying reality for 16 million citizens of East Germany living under the iron fist of the Stasi, the Ministry for State Security of the German Democratic Republic. This monstrous creation of the Kremlin became perhaps the most powerful and numerous secret service of the 20th century, a terrifying testament to total state control. From the moment it was created, the Stasi was conceived as an instrument of absolute power. After Germany's crushing defeat in World War II, the country was fragmented and divided into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, British, American, and French. Unlike the approach of the Western Allies, the Soviet Union decided to create a completely separate socialist state in the occupied territory. This deliberate political move led to the birth of the German Democratic Republic, GDR, in 1949, which radically changed the geopolitical landscape of post-war Europe. Just 1 year later, in 1950, the young GDR took steps to consolidate its power by creating the Ministry of State Security, or Staatssicherheit in German, better known by its abbreviation, Stasi. The clear and sole purpose of its creation was to establish total control over the population. Like the infamous Soviet NKVD and KGB, the Stasi operated with an unwavering mandate to infiltrate all spheres of life, sticking its nose in everything wherever possible. The main focus was on identifying and neutralizing any individuals or groups considered a threat to the socialist regime. The organization often positioned itself as the shield and sword of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, which clearly reflected its role as protector and enforcer. Indeed, the Stasi functioned as a brutal and effective repressive apparatus that was in practice under the direct control of the Kremlin's ruling elite. Alexander Ratkovsky, a respected member of the Bureau for the Study of the History of Secret Services, unequivocally calls Lavrentiy Beria, the infamous head of the Soviet secret police, the godfather of the Stasi. This direct link led Ratkovsky to conclude that the Stasi was effectively a copy of the NKVD. He also emphasized its strategic importance to the Soviet Union, suggesting that its success was due to Moscow's reliance on it as the main, last bastion of Soviet influence in the heart of Europe. Although the Stasi's operational methods drew heavily on Soviet precedents, they were not a simple imitation. They had distinctive features and in some cases even surpassed their Soviet predecessors in sophistication and cruelty. During the tense decades of the Cold War, the Stasi cemented its fearsome reputation and was widely recognized as the most powerful secret police force in the world. Its agents accumulated a staggering amount of knowledge about virtually every resident of the GDR, guided by their frighteningly comprehensive motto, "There is no such thing as unimportant information." The scale of this obsessive data collection was enormous and vividly illustrated the Stasi's pervasive influence. The underground vaults of the Ministry of State Security held meticulously compiled files on virtually every citizen of the country. If all these archives were laid out in a single line, they would stretch for 110 kilometers. This enormous text archive was supplemented by an equally extensive collection of additional data, including more than 23,000 magnetic recordings, over 2 million photographs, and 10,000 bags filled with what were ominously called Geruchskonserven, canned smells. These Geruchskonserven, literally translated as canned smells, were one of the Stasi's most innovative and disturbing tools for tracking people. In practice, they were carefully sealed ampules containing the distinctive scent of suspects. To obtain these scent samples, agents would typically acquire items, such as a piece of fabric taken from a chair where the suspect had sat, or, even more invasively, an item of clothing secretly stolen from the suspect's home. If necessary, these sealed ampules could be opened, allowing specially trained dogs to easily and accurately detect the wanted person. In addition to scent, the Stasi used even more insidious methods to maintain its iron grip on the population. Agents could track anyone in a crowded crowd by secretly attaching tiny radioactive elements to their clothing. These people could then be secretly monitored and controlled using a Geiger counter. This combination of low-tech and high-tech surveillance ensured, in principle, total control over the population. The terrifying effectiveness of this system meant that citizens were often unaware of the constant surveillance until something shocking happened, such as the sudden and inexplicable disappearance of a neighbor, mother, or even grandmother. As Diana Zvarun, a member of the Bureau for the Investigation of the History of the Secret Services, unequivocally states, it can be said with certainty that the Stasi exercised absolute control over all aspects of life in the GDR. One of the Stasi's priority targets was personal correspondence and parcels. Mailboxes located near houses were under constant photographic surveillance. When a letter was dropped into a mailbox, it was carefully opened, its contents read attentively, and then skillfully resealed without leaving any visible signs of opening. If any part of a letter aroused suspicion or its contents indicated a threat to the regime, the correspondence was confiscated and the addressee was immediately detained. In such a system, according to the source, it was physically impossible to keep any personal secrets. The scale of mail interception was staggering. Every year, an average of almost 25 million parcels were sent from West Germany to the GDR, and Stasi agents carefully opened each one. Perhaps the most psychologically destructive and insidious method used by the Stasi was Zersetzung. This technique, which translates as disintegration or decomposition, was a sophisticated form of psychological terror. Although the Stasi inherited the concept of persecuting dissidents from their Soviet counterparts, its agents employed Zersetzung with greater sophistication than their Soviet friends. The main goal of Zersetzung was to maximize the humiliation and psychological disorientation of the individual. This included a carefully planned series of disturbing, often seemingly insignificant intrusions designed to make the victim question their sanity. Special agents would secretly enter the victim's home when no one was there and discreetly rearrange personal belongings. Victims might receive endless phone calls in the middle of the night, find their alarm clocks inexplicably rearranged, or receive strange and unwanted packages at their home address. These relentless but easily deniable psychological attacks often drove victims to the brink of mental breakdown and frequently led to suicide. Zvarun emphasized the depth of this cynicism, saying that agents could even resort to such cynical methods as sending a coffin for a child to a young family. At the top of this formidable and terrifying organization for more than 3 decades, from 1957 to 1989, stood Erich Mielke. It was thanks to his unwavering leadership that the Stasi cemented its dubious reputation and became one of the most successful and truly influential secret services of its time. Mielke's long tenure was marked by intense and pervasive paranoia about betrayal lurking around every corner, a psychological tendency that pushed him to take increasingly absurd and extreme measures. His fearsome reputation preceded him, earning him universal recognition, respect, and above all, deep fear. Ratkovsky drew a frightening parallel, claiming that Mielke was effectively the Hitler of his time, having created a state within a state that wielded enormous influence and operated outside the traditional authority of other state bodies. Mielke demanded absolute and unwavering loyalty from all Stasi employees, especially new recruits. These new members had to take a solemn oath, promising to fight the enemies of socialism. Breaking this sacred vow had dire consequences. Instead of imprisonment, Stasi employees who violated it were immediately blacklisted and often subjected to summary execution. Once you joined the Stasi, there were only 2 acceptable ways out: honorable retirement after distinguished service or death. The Stasi's widespread surveillance meant that people lived in constant fear. No one could be completely sure who was informing on them. The terrifying reality was that even a close neighbor or lifelong friend could turn out to be an informer. The identities of these numerous informants only became known after German reunification and the subsequent massive effort to open the extensive Stasi archives. Despite the unprecedented opportunity to expose those who had spied on them, many Germans were reluctant to take advantage of it. The reasons were deeply personal and often painful. It often turned out that the agency's informants were their closest relatives. These insidious methods and the very structure of the Stasi were largely borrowed from their Soviet counterparts. The 2 secret services maintained close cooperation, exchanging intelligence on all fronts that could be mutually beneficial. The depth of this partnership was so great that branches of Soviet security agents were even established in Germany, operating with the same jurisdiction and rights as in the USSR itself. This profound influence led to a stark conclusion, as formulated by the source. The Kremlin had undoubtedly created a monster. This monstrous creation, the Stasi, was not simply a copy of its Soviet predecessors. It was claimed to have even surpassed its creator in efficiency and ruthlessness. The Chekists effectively passed on their extensive experience in persecuting dissidents to the Germans. However, as noted earlier, Stasi agents carried out these persecutions, in particular through methods such as Zersetzung, with a more sophisticated and subtle approach than their more overt Soviet friends. The Stasi's pervasive control extended to its own network of detention facilities, the most notorious of which was the Berlin Hohenschönhausen prison. This prison served as a place of brutal detention for a certain category of individuals. Those who were desperate enough to attempt to flee to the West, political dissidents, and even individuals who simply appeared suspicious to the authorities. Within its walls, prisoners were subjected to brutal torture aimed at extracting information about their activities and possible involvement in groups seeking to overthrow the GDR regime. Historically, Berlin Hohenschönhausen had a grim past, having previously belonged to the Soviet Union as Special Camp No. 3, a place notorious for the physical extermination of people. In the 1950s, it was converted into the Stasi's Central Investigative Prison, becoming a top-secret facility that was deliberately removed from all possible maps to conceal its existence. Peter Kiup, a former prisoner at Berlin Hohenschönhausen and a historian by profession, a group that Stasi agents kept under particularly close surveillance, recounted a telling anecdote about the strange, psychologically manipulative treatment he received from prison staff. He recalled how a prison worker regularly asked if he could help with anything. Once craving a cigarette, Coop asked if he could take a pack from his backpack. The guard replied, "Yes, of course." However, when he returned to his cell, Kiup found the pack of cigarettes on the table, but most importantly, without matches or a lighter. They had been deliberately removed so that he could not smoke, a cruel act of psychological humiliation rather than physical deprivation. In addition to internal oppression, the Stasi was very skilled at covert espionage abroad, extending its tentacles into the political life of various countries. One of the most intriguing and scandalous stories is connected with Ellen Romek, described as an ambiguous figure surrounded by myths and legends. She was sent to Washington, specifically to the West German embassy. In the 1960s, Romek was publicly exposed as a spy and accused of having ties to the Stasi. According to one of the most widespread versions of events, she got a job at a club frequented by high-ranking officials. There, she allegedly began a relationship with the aim of obtaining secret information, which she then passed on to the GDR. Her fame grew when she was even linked to an alleged affair with the 35th U.S. President, John F. Kennedy. The FBI quickly launched an investigation. Despite all efforts, her direct involvement with the Stasi could not be conclusively proven, but she was nevertheless expelled from the U.S. Another controversial figure was Karl-Heinz Kurras, a West Berlin police officer who voluntarily became an informant for the Stasi. Unlike many who were coerced, Kurras came forward and offered his services. He proved to be very effective in his role, providing Stasi agents with a wealth of confidential information about police personnel changes, specific operational procedures at various police stations, and detailed plans developed against the GDR. Remarkably, Kurras survived his dismissal from the Stasi after completing his term of service, which testifies to his successful double life. However, Kurras' operational relationship with the Stasi was abruptly terminated after a critical incident in June 1967. During a demonstration in the streets where many students and other protesters had gathered, Kurras, acting as a police officer, decided to open fire. His shot tragically struck 26-year-old Benno Onesorg in the back of the head, killing him. Realizing the disaster for its image and the potential threat of exposure, the Stasi immediately severed all ties and cooperation with its former agent. All subsequent attempts by Kurras to return to the Stasi were met with an impenetrable wall of refusal. As a result, he retired peacefully and lived out his life until 2014, remarkably without ever being punished for his crime. Despite the high risks, the Stasi masterfully infiltrated its agents into the most sensitive places, sending them where even ordinary law enforcement officers were afraid to look. The most famous achievement in this area was that of Günther Guillaume, widely known as the Stasi's most successful spy. His extraordinary story began in the 1950s, when the GDR authorities strategically sent him and his wife to West Berlin under the guise of refugees, carefully preparing the ground for his deep cover operation. Over the course of several years, thanks to his painstaking work, Guillaume successfully adapted to his new life and quietly infiltrated the political arena of West Germany. By the 1970s, he had risen to a position of enormous trust, becoming a trusted aide and close confidant of then-Chancellor Willy Brandt. Using his unique position, Guillaume actively passed on important information about the political intentions of the federal government to Moscow. Researchers widely acknowledge that the successful ratification of the crucial treaty between West Germany, RFRG, the Soviet Union, USSR, Poland, and the GDR, which officially recognized the eastern borders of the FRG after the war, was directly linked to Guillaume's indispensable espionage activities. Despite thorough checks and 11 months of continuous surveillance, the Stasi curators managed to prevent him from being caught red-handed for a considerable period of time. It was not until 1975 that he was finally arrested and subsequently sentenced to 13 years in prison, while his wife received 8 years for complicity. The consequences of Guillaume's exposure were so significant that they led to the resignation of Willy Brandt, cementing the operation's status as the most successful in the history of the Stasi. Collaboration with politicians was not uncommon for the Stasi. Even former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, according to some sources, used its services. The Stasi's influence even extended to the critically important sphere of superpower diplomacy. In particular, it penetrated the delicate negotiations on the missile treaty between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the 1980s. At that time, West Germany was a key component of NATO's strike capability, where the Americans had deployed more than 100 medium-range ballistic missile launchers. This posed a serious strategic threat to the USSR, as such missiles could reach strategically important targets on the territory of the then Russia in less than 10 minutes. And at that time, intercepting such modern weapons was virtually impossible. As a result, the Stasi played an important role in the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF Treaty, between the U.S. and the USSR in 1987, which was a landmark agreement signed by Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. The Stasi's grim history ultimately came to an abrupt end in 1989. That year, the GDR was rocked by a revolutionary popular uprising, during which angry crowds symbolically and effectively seized the Stasi headquarters. In a desperate and chaotic attempt to prevent the disclosure and widespread dissemination of compromising information about the activities of German agents, the Soviet Union intervened to assist in the rapid and complete destruction of the documents. The archives were hastily torn apart, mechanically shredded, and hastily buried in bags. The scale of the historical material destroyed was enormous, so much so that work to restore these priceless archives continues to this day. At the same time as this desperate act of concealment, the Stasi itself was officially disbanded. This chaotic and disgraceful end brought the history of the powerful, albeit deeply sinister, German Secret Service to a close. However, the Stasi's legacy lives on, and surprising connections are emerging in the modern era. Have you heard the name Matthias Warnig? He is known as a former Stasi agent and personal friend of Vladimir Putin. According to available information, their friendship began when both were working in the secret services of the USSR and the GDR. Today, Warnig holds influential positions as a member of the supervisory board of Russian oil giant Rosneft and state-owned bank VTB. Putin himself recognized Warnig's contribution by awarding him the prestigious Order of Honor, which is usually given to those who have made a significant contribution to Russia's development. Perhaps most notably, Warnig is the CEO of Nord Stream 2 AG, the operating company behind the controversial Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project. This major gas pipeline, designed to run through the Baltic Sea from Russia directly to the European Union, is intended to divert a significant portion of Gazprom's gas supplies away from Ukraine's gas transportation system. At the time of publication, construction of the pipeline was approximately 92% complete. However, its completion has faced serious obstacles. Then-President Donald Trump signed the 2020 budget, which included sanctions specifically targeting companies involved in the construction of the second line of Nord Stream 2 through the Baltic Sea. Despite these sanctions, Russia remains determined to complete the construction of Nord Stream 2, stating that it plans to do so no later than the first quarter of 2021. This ongoing geopolitical struggle, in which a former Stasi agent plays a key role, highlights the strength and complexity of the network of influence woven by the secret services of the past. The Stasi, created to protect the socialist state, has ironically become its suffocating internal enemy. Its relentless pursuit of total control, innovative and often brutal methods of surveillance and psychological pressure, and close ties to the Kremlin paint a grim picture of a police state that has reached unprecedented levels of manipulation. Although it was officially disbanded, its chilling history serves as a powerful and indelible reminder of what a regime is capable of doing to stay in power and of the long dark shadows cast by such a monster.